Have you ever caught yourself watching an older person, maybe at a park, maybe at a family gathering, and for just a second, a quiet, uncomfortable thought slips into your mind? Why are they like that? And then just as quickly, you push that thought away because it feels wrong, almost disrespectful. Like you're not supposed to notice the little things, the awkward pauses, the repeated stories, the strange habits that don't quite make sense anymore. But the truth is, those little things aren't random at all. They're pieces of a much bigger picture, a story nobody really prepares you for. Because aging isn't just about getting wrinkles or slowing down. It's about slowly watching parts of yourself fade, shift, or sometimes completely disappear. And what makes it harder, what makes it almost unbearable sometimes, is that most seniors go through this silently, with a smile on their face, pretending everything's okay, while inside things feel very, very different. And that's where it starts, with something small, something almost harmless, like repeating the same story again and again. And you've seen it, right? Maybe it's your grandfather talking about the same job he had 40 years ago, or your grandmother telling you about the same neighbor who moved away decades ago. And at first, you laugh, you nod. You say, "Yeah, I remember," even if you don't. But then it keeps happening, again and again. And slowly, it starts to feel frustrating. Like, why don't they realize they've already said this? But here's the part nobody tells you. It's not just forgetfulness. It's not just memory slipping away like people casually say. It's deeper than that. It's about holding on to identity. Because when your present starts to feel empty or uncertain, your past becomes your anchor, your safe place, the one thing that still feels solid. So they go back to it over and over, not because they want to annoy you, but because that's where they still feel like themselves. And yeah, it can feel repetitive. But for them, it's not repetition, it's reassurance. It's a way of saying, I was someone, I mattered. And that realization, it hits differently when you really think about it. And then there's this shift that creeps in slowly, almost unnoticed at first. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's the stubbornness, the kind that doesn't make sense on the surface. Like refusing help when it's clearly needed, insisting on doing things the hard way, pushing people away with phrases like, I'm fine, or leave me alone. I got this, and it can come off as frustrating, even a little aggressive, like why not just accept help? Why make life harder than it already is? But what looks like stubbornness from the outside often feels like survival from the inside. Because when you've spent your entire life being independent, making your own decisions, taking care of others, the idea of needing help, it's not just uncomfortable, it's terrifying. It feels like losing control, like slipping into a version of yourself you never wanted to become. So they fight it, even when it doesn't make logical sense, even when it leads to mistakes, because at least in those moments, they still feel in charge, still feel like they haven't completely lost themselves yet. And that kind of quiet battle, the one between needing help and refusing it, it happens more often than people realize. And it's not loud, it's not traumatic, but it's there every single day. And then comes something that almost everyone notices, but rarely understands. The complaining, the constant commentary about everything. The food isn't right. The weather's too hot or too cold. People are too loud. The world is moving too fast. And yeah, it can get exhausting to listen to. It can feel like nothing is ever good enough anymore. But what if it's not really about the complaints themselves? What if it's about something deeper, something harder to put into words? Because when your world starts to shrink, when your physical abilities change, when your social circle gets smaller and smaller, even the tiniest discomfort can feel magnified. And complaining becomes less about negativity and more about expression. it becomes a way to still feel connected, to still have a voice, because silence, real silence, is something many seniors fear more than anything else. And if complaining keeps that silence away, even for a moment, then maybe it serves a purpose. Even if it's not pretty, and then there's this quiet shift in how they present themselves. Something subtle but noticeable, where appearance starts to matter less. Clothes don't match the way they used to. Grooming becomes inconsistent, and from the outside, it's easy to assume they've just stopped caring, that they've given up in some way. But that assumption misses something important, because what looks like neglect can actually be exhaustion, the kind that builds up over years. When simple tasks that once took minutes now require effort, planning, energy that isn't always there. And when you have to choose between getting through the day or looking perfect while doing it, the choice becomes very clear, and slowly, appearance moves down the list of priorities, not because it doesn't matter, but because other things like just getting through the day matter more. And that shift, it's not dramatic. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's real. And it says a lot about how aging changes what we value, what we hold on to, and what we quietly let go. And somewhere along the way, something else begins to change too. Something that can be hard to deal with, especially for younger people trying to understand it. And that's the increase in judgment. The way seniors sometimes become more critical, more resistant to new ideas, more likely to compare everything to how it used to be, and it can feel unfair, even irritating. Like, why not just accept that times have changed? Why not try to understand the new world instead of pushing against it? But from their perspective, it's not that simple. Because the world they grew up in, the rules they learned, the values they built their lives around, they don't always match what they see now. And that disconnect creates discomfort, confusion, sometimes even fear. And when people feel that way, they don't always adapt. Sometimes they push back, sometimes they judge. Not because they want to be difficult, but because it's their way of holding on to what feels familiar, what feels right to them, even if it doesn't align with everything around them anymore. And if you look at it that way, it doesn't necessarily make it easier to deal with, but it does make it easier to understand, and understanding. That's where everything starts to shift, because the moment you stop seeing these behaviors as random or annoying, and start seeing them as responses to deeper changes, deeper fears, deeper realities, everything begins to feel different. And maybe, just maybe, a little more human, a little more real, and a lot harder to ignore. And just when you think you've started to understand it, just when it feels like you've figured out why these changes happen, something even quieter begins to take over, something you don't always see right away. And that's the distance, the slow, almost invisible drift away from people, from conversations, from the outside world. Because one day they're showing up, they're laughing, they're part of everything. And then gradually, without any big announcement, they start saying, maybe next time, or I'm a little tired today. And those moments add up, turning into days, then weeks. And before you even realize it, their world becomes smaller, quieter, more contained. And it's easy to assume they just prefer it that way, that they've become antisocial or uninterested. But the truth is way more complicated than that, because staying connected takes energy, it takes effort. It takes a kind of emotional strength that isn't always available anymore, especially when you've experienced loss. Not just once, but over and over again, losing friends, losing family members, losing people who were part of your everyday life, and each loss leaves a mark. A kind of heaviness that doesn't fully go away, so sometimes pulling back feels safer than risking more pain, and that isolation, it changes people. It reshapes how they think, how they react, how they carry themselves, and then there's the way they start to handle money. which might seem small on the surface, but it tells a much bigger story underneath. Because some seniors become extremely cautious, almost overly protective of every dollar they have, hesitating to spend even on things they need, and from the outside, it can look like they're being unreasonable. Like, why not enjoy what you've worked your whole life for? Why hold back now? But when you've lived through uncertainty, when you've seen how quickly things can change, that caution isn't just a habit, it's a shield. It's a way of protecting yourself from a future that feels unpredictable because the fear of running out, the fear of depending on others, it's always there, quietly influencing decisions, shaping behaviors, even when it doesn't make perfect sense to anyone else. And alongside that fear comes resistance. Resistance to change in almost every form, whether it's technology, new routines, or even different ways of thinking. And yeah, it can feel frustrating when they won't try something new, when they shut it down before even giving it a chance. But imagine being in a world that no longer feels like yours, where everything moves faster than you can keep up, where the rules keep shifting, and nothing feels stable anymore. In that kind of environment, holding on to what you already know isn't just preference. It's survival. It's the one thing that still feels steady, still feels safe. And then there's something deeper, something more emotional that starts to show up in subtle ways. And that's the way they begin to live more in the past than in the present, telling stories, revisiting memories, holding on to moments that happened decades ago, like they just occurred yesterday. And it's easy to think they're stuck, that they're not moving forward. But what if it's not about being stuck at all? What if it's about finding comfort in a time when things felt clearer, when life made more sense? Because the present can feel uncertain, and the future, well, the future can feel like a question they don't always want to answer, so they go back not to escape reality, but to reconnect with a version of themselves that still feels whole, still feels certain. And somewhere in the middle of all this, their emotional expression begins to change too, becoming more reserved, more controlled, less open than it used to be. And that shift can be confusing, especially for people who remember them being more expressive, more engaged. But it's not that the feelings are gone. It's that they've been felt so many times, in so many different ways, that expressing them doesn't always come as naturally anymore. Sometimes it feels easier to keep things inside, to avoid the vulnerability that comes with opening up. And then there are the habits that seem strange from the outside, the ones that people often joke about without really thinking, like holding on to things that don't seem useful anymore, keeping items that others might throw away without a second thought. And it's easy to label it as clutter, as unnecessary, but to them, those objects aren't just things, they're connections. They're reminders of moments, of people, of experiences that shaped their life. And letting go of them can feel like letting go of parts of themselves, parts they're not ready to lose, not yet. And then, quietly, almost in the background of everything else, there's a thought that starts to appear more often than people realize. Not always spoken out loud, not always obvious, but present nonetheless. And that's the awareness of time. The awareness that it's limited, that it's moving faster than it used to. And that realization, it changes everything. It changes how they see the world, how they value moments, how they interact with people. Sometimes it makes them more reflective, more thoughtful, but other times it makes them withdraw, makes them hold back. Because facing that reality isn't easy. It's not something you just accept without it affecting you in some way. And when you put all of this together, the repetition, the stubbornness, the complaints, the changes in appearance, the judgment, the isolation, the caution, the resistance, the memories, the emotional shifts, the habits, and that quiet awareness of time, you start to see something different, something deeper than just ugly behaviors. you start to see a story. A very human story. One that's not always comfortable, not always easy to understand, but real nonetheless. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the goal isn't to judge these changes or even to fix them, but to recognize them for what they are. Signs of a life that's been lived fully. Signs of someone navigating a stage of life that comes with its own challenges, its own fears, its own realities. And if you really sit with that thought for a moment, it changes how you see things. It changes how you react, because one day, whether we think about it or not, whether we're ready or not, we're going to be in that same position, facing our own version of these changes, our own version of these realities. And the question then won't be, why do they act like that? It'll be, how do I want to be understood when I get there? And that's why this matters. That's why paying attention to these details, these patterns, these behaviors, it's not just about understanding others. It's about preparing ourselves, about learning, about building a perspective that's grounded in empathy instead of judgment. Because at the end of the day, aging isn't something that happens to other people. It's something that's happening to all of us, every single day, in ways big and small. And if this made you pause, even for a second, if it made you think about someone in your life, or maybe even about yourself, then don't just move on like it didn't happen. Say something, share your thoughts, drop a comment, because these conversations, the real ones, the honest ones, they matter more than we think. And maybe, just maybe, they're the first step toward understanding something we've all been avoiding for far too long. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who might see things a little differently after listening, don't keep it to yourself. Send it to them, start that conversation. Because sometimes, the things we don't talk about are the ones that matter the most. And as for you, moving forward, try to notice. Try to listen a little more closely. Try to understand before reacting, because behind every behavior, no matter how confusing or frustrating it might seem,